Professor,
Yes.
did you can read that?
Yeah, it's backwards, but I can read it. Yeah.
Ah, okay. Backwards. Okay. Good morning, everyone. We give you a very high welcome. Please, we give apologize for the time. We have a little issues with the Zoom meeting, but we are back here now. Um, please welcome Professor Dorian Cantor. He works as political scientist and professor at Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogota. He specialized in U.S. politics, national security policy, and national security law. And we are here today to discuss Joe Biden's political foreign policy towards Latin America. So it's clear that in the first weeks of the Biden administration, the 46th US president foreign policy is beginning to take shape in its first 100 days. It has signed a lot of agreements and executive notes. He has undoubtedly sought to replicate much of Trump's approach, which was itself a radical break from U.S. foreign policy traditions, including the strategic regional um, role of Latin America. So in this scenario, we bring you here Professor Dorian Cantor to give you a broader insight and the complete picture about this topic. So we welcome you now.
Uh, Thank you, Axel, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to talk about Joe Biden's foreign policy toward Latin America. Um, okay, so I am going to share my screen with you guys. Just give me 1 second. Okay. All right. So,
Yeah, it's all there.
all right. Thank you very much. All right, so let's get started. This is somewhat of an in-depth introduction, but I'm going to try to keep it simple and keep it short. Oh, okay. All right. Can you, Akshay, can you confirm that you can see the slides?
Yeah, we now see the slides.
Okay, excellent. Perfect. All right, so Biden's Latin America policy expectations, projections, and the actions taken so far that we have seen so far in the Biden administration, the first 100 days, as Akshay said. All right, so since the 1980s, U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America has rested on three pillars. Those three pillars are free trade, democracy and governance, and security. And today in this talk, we're going to look at each of those areas under President Biden, and also comparing him to Donald Trump. Of course, the title of today's lecture is Biden's Latin America policy, but we cannot talk about the future of U.S. Latin American relations without first briefly discussing the policy of the past 4 years. Trump's victory in 2016 was a surprise. It was a surprise for us in the United States, and it caught Latin America also by surprise. And expectations regarding what the new administration would mean for the future were negative across the region. Those expectations were borne out by the reality of Trump's style of governing, of course. His approach was harshly uncooperative. and his America First policy ended up leaving America alone. With regard to Latin America, Trump revived a decidedly Cold War style mentality, focusing on anti-communism and leveraging hard power at the expense of soft power. At the same time, during his 4 years in office, he exhibited a hands-off approach to the rule of law, democracy, and the environment. The sharp turn from Obama's policies can be observed in Trump's budget requests. In 2018, for example, the Trump administration proposed to cut State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development budgets by 32%, USA to Mexico by 45%, Guatemala 38%, Honduras 31%. The cuts were the cuts also decreased funding for educational and cultural exchange by over 50%, which was a major hit to U.S. soft power projection. Congress eventually modified these numbers upwards, but these figures indicate shifting U.S. policy in the region. Trump also halted much of the aid destined for Central America in an effort to pressure them on migration issues. And we should also remember that his presidency encouraged illiberal leaders with authoritarian tendencies, such as Jair Bolsonaro. Democracy, governance, and support for human rights took a backseat during the Trump administration, and this is especially true for the Latin American region. The focus of the security pillar under Donald Trump was on hard initiatives, such as enforcement programs and interdiction, with extensive pressure on Latin American nations to increase anti-drug efforts. In terms of his immigration policies, their inhumane nature is well documented, and we will revisit some of them in a few minutes. Sadly and counterproductively, instead of leveraging U.S. power to deal with underlying issues, Donald Trump decided to build physical barriers, which resulted in political and cultural barriers as well. Ultimately, it is a powerful indictment of former President Trump that even China's Xi Jinping was more trusted around the globe than the 45th president of the United States. Let's look at Joe Biden's background a little bit before we get into the issues. Joe Biden, the 46th president of the United States, he previously served as Barack Obama's vice president. Expectations for Joe Biden for the region, for the Latin American region, for building a more constructive relationship with Latin America are exceptionally high. In terms of domestic politics, in terms of we can explain in terms of the 2020 electoral results, in which 2/3 of Latinx voters or votes went to Joe Biden. Under President Obama, Biden traveled to Latin America 16 times. He was Obama's main emissary to the region, and he was also Obama's point person on initiatives to combat violence and drugs in Colombia, for example, political corruption in Guatemala and other places. If there's one prominent U.S. politician who personifies the good neighbor approach crafted by FDR, then it is Joe Biden. Given his prior experience as vice president and as the senator from Delaware who served in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he brings a deep knowledge of the region to the presidency, deeper than any U.S. president since at least the end of the Cold War. Indeed, Joe Biden has promised a greater focus in the region, which would be a welcome change after 4 years of willful neglect. And while we'll touch on many specific policy areas, Joe Biden's most immediate and important task with regard to Latin America is to change the tone of U.S. policy toward the region. Next, I'm going to briefly look at the region and sort of a little bit of background information here. We're going to take a bird's eye view. There are staggering challenges that face Latin America at the moment that complicate U.S. foreign policy or U.S. policy toward the region. This COVID-19 crisis, climate change, poverty, inequality, and corruption, among others. Of course, not all leaders were happy to see the White House change hands. Among them, for example, Jair Bolsonaro or Andrés Manuel López Obrador of Mexico. As President Biden pledged to defend democracy, combat corruption, and address the threat of climate change. To give you one example, he promised a $20 billion fund to preserve the Amazon, but he also threatened Brazil that the country would face economic consequences if it did not slow deforestation. As Biden gears up to deal with quite literally a world of challenges, Latin America as a region is ideologically divided, inwardly focused, and suffering a once-in-a-century economic crisis, not to mention that the current crop of Latin American leaders does not include any obvious statesmen. Nevertheless, Biden must reposition the U.S. for leadership in the region, and he needs a long-term hemispheric strategy. He will hopefully take the opportunity of the 2021 Summit of the Americas in the fall to do just that. And as Biden wrote in his memoir, Promise Me, Dad, he had long felt as though the United States was, quote, a bully dictating policy to smaller countries in Latin America. Instead, in the words of his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, he promises a new overall approach of mutual respect and a sense of shared responsibility. As Biden's Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, observed, the United States can't solve all the world's problems, but the U.S. at its best still has a greater ability than any other country on earth to bring together others to meet the challenges of our time. So we can expect significant moves from Biden in the Latin American region. Nevertheless, to be fair, Europe and Asia will likely take precedence over Latin American and U.S. foreign policy under President Biden, but the willful neglect of the Trump administration is coming to a much needed close. So let's look at some of the ideal policy outcomes that we should expect from Joe Biden and some of the specific steps that he has taken. We're going to look at migration. We're going to look at vaccine diplomacy. We're also going to look at regional influence instead of taking on China. And lastly, rebuilding trust in the region toward the United States. So we're going to talk with migration. I'm going to use the term migration and immigration somewhat interchangeably here. In the area of migration, we see and especially immigration policy, we see a marked difference to Donald Trump, who wanted to stop all migration and end the Dreamers program, the protection of those Americans who arrived to the United States as children through no fault of their own, and they remain undocumented, which was put in place under Barack Obama's presidency. Biden's challenge in terms of migration is a once-in-a-generation pandemic, natural disasters, poverty, violence, and corruption that constitute the push factors driving desperate individuals to seek a better life in the United States. His other challenge is how to control migration while also upholding the rights of migrants, and especially asylum seekers. Lastly, another daunting challenge is how to process those individuals more quickly and more efficiently. So what can we already see under President Biden that has become evident in the past 100 years? Well, 100 years, sorry, in the past, not even 100 days, right? We're right about 80 some days into his presidency. So Biden does not advocate open borders, but there has been a sharp and rapid turn toward a more humane immigration policy. What does this mean? It means keeping families together, addressing the root causes of irregular migration, and streamlining the legal immigration system. How has Joe Biden achieved meaningful change in such a short period of time? The answer is through executive orders. As president, he can order the bureaucracy, administrative agencies to change the way the laws are executed while remaining within the confines of the law. And while his executive orders have only addressed the tip of the iceberg, they have been significant nonetheless. Number one, Biden has signed the executive order on the establishment of an interagency task force on the reunification of families separated by the U.S. government in connection with the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy. This was an inhumane policy under Trump that mandated systematic separation of children from their immediate or extended family members, affecting thousands of children, hundreds of whom still have yet to be reunited with their families. Number two, Biden has also ordered a review and revamping of the asylum process in the executive order titled Creating a Comprehensive Regional Framework to Address the Causes of Immigration, to manage migration throughout North and Central America, and to provide safe and orderly processing of asylum seekers at the United States border. As part of this order, Biden did away with what is called the Migrant Protection Protocol, put in place under President Trump, which forced asylum seekers to wait for U.S. immigration proceedings to unfold in an open-air refugee camp in Mexico. And what concrete steps have been taken to this point? The Department of Homeland Security has begun processing those asylum seekers, and the administration is seeking additional funds and resources to do the processing in an orderly and expedited fashion. Number three, Biden has also terminated Trump's national emergency with respect to the southern border, and ended the redirection of funds diverted to border wall construction. Instead, Biden has proposed smart border enforcement efforts such as cameras, x-rays, sensors, and potentially face recognition, although these measures, of course, are not without controversy. But here we definitely also see a change, a move away from Trump's policies of building barriers. The fourth is DACA, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Biden's executive order also promises to reaffirms his commitment to preserve the DACA program and to protect DACA recipients. It paves the way for nearly 650,000 Dreamers to renew their DACA status, and for more than 300,000 DACA-eligible U.S. residents to apply for the program. It also reaffirms Biden's commitment to create a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers. And although Biden's immigration executive orders do not address temporary protective status, much of which the Trump administration are allowed to expire, leaving countless U.S. residents without proper legal status, the administration has since extended TPS status, for example, to Venezuelans. Of course, a key element of Biden's migration policies regards Central America, and especially the challenges in the Northern Triangle, which includes Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Biden has a special concern for those countries. As vice president, in fact, he was the architect of the Alliance for Prosperity Cooperation. And as president, he has proposed a $4 billion package to address economic security and governance causes of migration. Using those funds, so the theory goes, would eliminate the push factors that drive migrants to the United States. Biden also promised to do away with the asylum cooperative agreements made by the Trump administration with the Northern Triangle countries, which forced people fleeing for their lives to seek asylum in the very countries that they had fled. In February 2021, so just a couple months ago, the State Department issued a statement announcing immediate suspension and eventual termination of the asylum cooperative agreements. In order to deal with Central American migration, Biden has to cooperate with Mexico. However, during López Obrador's presidency, we've seen the precipitous deterioration of the bilateral security relationship with the United States and its southern neighbor. What has caused this bilateral security relationship to sour? One reason, or rather a symptom, is the exoneration of Mexico's former defense secretary, Salvador Cienfuegos, whom U.S. authorities arrested and accused of drug trafficking, money laundering, and cooperating with brutal cartels. This reveals, so that his exoneration reveals the lack of a concentrated effort on part of the Mexican government to root out corruption and organized crime. And to add insult to injury, in December of 2020, the Mexican Congress passed a new law severely restricting cooperation between the United States and Mexico. Essentially, the law paralyzes Mexico's cooperation with international law enforcement counterparts, and it eviscerates the trust and law enforcement cooperation that had existed between the U.S. and Mexico. Nevertheless, Biden will have to cooperate with Lopez Obrador to be able to deal with the migrant crisis. The facts on the ground are that Mexico has effectively turned into a proxy for Trump's border wall. And the US needs to maintain a working relationship with Mexico, not only to control migration, but also to ensure the rights of migrants. Mexico is in favor of the $4 billion investment plan to reduce the push factors from the Northern Triangle. But Biden must convince the Mexican government not only to control the southern border, but also to respect international protections for asylum seekers. Ultimately, Biden's goals must be common success rather than physical, ideological, and political barriers that we saw under President Trump. President Biden has been able to do a lot and quite quickly in the realm of U.S. immigration policy via executive orders. But legislation is necessary to make those changes more permanent. In fact, recently Democrats unveiled a sweeping immigration bill called the U.S. Citizenship Act, which essentially mirrors Biden's stated priorities, and it has three main pillars. Number one is pathway to citizenship for over 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. This includes both DACA recipients and also some individuals who enjoy TPS status. Number two, the bill also proposes to increase border security at ports of entry by providing much needed resources. And as the third pillar, it would relieve the pressure on the asylum system by funding more immigration judges to deal with the backlog that was created under President Trump. Additionally, asylum seekers would also receive pro bono representation, especially children, so that they can comply with the requirements of the process. As we witnessed over the past 4 years, Trump's anti-immigration and zero-tolerance policies wound up in disaster. Children separated from their parents, migrants suffering in detention centers, loss of U.S. prestige and credibility in immigration-related matters. What the Democrats correctly identify in this bill is that there must be a system that provides new immigrants with the opportunity to make their case before the U.S. government, whether it's family-based immigration, diversity visas, work visas, or asylum applications. Ultimately, there must be a recognition of the fact that immigrants have contributed greatly to building American prosperity, and increasing competitiveness. And we as a nation must honor that history and ensure that the immigration system reflects the contributions that immigrants make to our country. The next area that we're going to look at is COVID-19. First, let's look at some sobering figures. Deaths in the region, Latin America region, have reached roughly 820,000. Economic contraction, on the other hand, was roughly 8% in 2020, while growth is projected to be about 3% to 4% in 2021. This is still 9 percentage points below the projected pre-pandemic trend. On the slide, you can see the GDP contraction in the region's 6 largest economies. Sadly, Latin America compares unfavorably with other emerging market regions, meaning that the contraction is deeper and the rebound weaker than elsewhere, leading to a further widening of the already wide income gaps across the region. According to the International Monetary Fund, the COVID-19 crisis is the steepest economic contraction in over 100 years, erasing a decade of anti-poverty gains and exacerbating rampant inequality. As we have slowly inched toward a vaccine, a much-needed and long-anticipated light at the end of the proverbial tunnel, Western vaccine makers have told the countries of the region, the Latin American region, that they would have to wait, leading to inadequate vaccine supplies. By contrast, both Russia and China have provided vaccines to Latin America. In the global scramble for vaccines, Sputnik V and Sinovac have been made available to the region, while Pfizer, Moderna, and other vaccines have been in short supply. Next, let's look at the US's opportunities and imperatives for vaccine diplomacy in the region. The United States is soon to reach a vaccine surplus. In fact, there will be a surplus in the coming weeks. If production stays at the current rate, by the end of July, about 920 million, almost 1 billion doses can be available in the United States, meaning that the US could vaccinate the entire population twice. So what is the reason for this overproduction, overpurchasing? In fact, it appears to have been the right strategy for a number of reasons. Number one, there have been unforeseen problems with some vaccines, such as the current pause of the J&J vaccine and the production hiccup in Baltimore that caused millions of vaccines to be destroyed. Also, efficacy was difficult to foresee. So casting a wider net meant that there would eventually be a sizable supply of effective vaccines to be put into people's arms. And as the science develops, we are also learning that emerging variants may require booster shots, leading to the need for more shots overall. And lastly, there's considerable uncertainty about the duration of immunity that is provided by these vaccines. So if we need to revaccinate within 9 to 12 months, then we might have to do a whole new round of vaccinations, meaning that the US will have to tap into the backup supply. And so all of the above are not just good reasons for over purchasing, but they also counsel for holding on to those doses, so kind of hoarding doses. So next, let's look at the reasons why the U.S. should share its vaccine supply. Sorry, it's still at the bottom of that slide. First, there's still parts of the world that don't have access to vaccines. Because developed countries have built up a huge backup supply, and as a result, for example, COVAX is really struggling to achieve any semblance of global equity. COVAX has, sorry, it's on this slide still. COVAX has sent out 38 million doses of to 104 of the poorest countries in the world, but this makes up less than 5% of all the vaccines distributed so far. Just like China and Russia, the U.S. has an enormous opportunity for global leadership by acting in an urgent way to supply poor countries with vaccines. Some developments are promising. For example, the U.S. has rejoined the WHO and COVAX, reserving the unfathomably ill-conceived decision of the Trump administration to withdraw from the WHO. Importantly, the U.S. could share surplus doses, not just because it is the right thing to do ideologically or politically, but because the longer the virus rages in other parts of the world, the more risk there is of new variants developing, which would be a risk to the health of even vaccinated Americans. Also, from an economic perspective, U.S. growth is inextricably tied to global growth. So isolation has no role to play in the U.S. position, no matter the ideological perspective. You might want to ask the question, why is that Latin America should receive priority consideration in terms of accessing excess doses? Many leaders in the region have the impression that Washington is hoarding the vaccines, and this impression needs to change. Another non-negligible factor is that many countries in the region are gearing up for elections. And the U.S. should prevent authoritarian powers like China and Russia from undermining or displacing U.S. influence in the region. Next, if the U.S. doesn't catch up with Russia and China, then Russia and China stand to gain significant goodwill and enhanced influence as they are delivering much-needed results to people in need. While the U.S. is playing second fiddle or third fiddle or really no fiddle at all. So why should the U.S. prioritize Latin America? The short answer is strategic self-interest. Given the region's proximity, it inevitably affects the daily lives of US citizens more directly than other parts of the world. For example, the new Brazilian variant could wreak havoc in the US even after Americans achieve herd immunity. Therefore, the ability of the virus to mutate must be shut down through massive regional immunization. Lastly, to make a connection back to immigration, the pandemic and the economic meltdown are exacerbating the region's migration crises from Venezuela and Central America. So a region-wide vaccination drive would assist the crisis-stricken continent to return to a more stable footing. What are the actual policy movements that we've seen so far out of the Biden administration? About a week ago, the Biden administration named the coordinator for U.S. vaccine diplomacy worldwide. Secretary of State Blinken announced that Gail Smith, who was U.S. Agency of International Development coordinator under Obama, would now be the coordinator for global COVID response and health security at the Department of State. This approach is, to state the obvious, a welcome change from Trump's America First policies, and it helps to reassure countries seeking more supply that Washington, and not just China, is moving to distribute vaccines. As Secretary of State Blinken said, and I quote, "I know that many countries are asking the United States to do more, some with growing desperation because of the scope and the scale of their COVID emergencies. We hear you, and I promise we're moving as fast as possible. We've already loaned vaccines to our closest neighbors, Mexico and Canada, and we'll work with global partners in manufacturing and supplies to ensure there will be enough vaccine for everyone, everywhere." Here in the statement, Blinken refers to the U.S. Recently sending 4 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has not been approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, to Mexico and Canada. Another promising development, although it won't affect Latin America, or at least not at first, is that as part of the Quad cooperation with Japan, India, and Australia, the United States has announced that it would supply more than 1 billion COVID vaccines across Asia by the end of 2022. The next issue area we have to look at is taking on China and maintaining regional influence. As one of its many failures, the Trump administration did next to nothing to counter the growing influence of China in the Latin American region. But the truth is, this was not the Trump administration alone that let this happen. In fact, this has been going on for over a decade. And truth be told, as Vice President Biden did little to slow down this trend. Right now, China is the top trading partner of the region, and many countries are completely dependent on China. China is the #1 trading partner of Brazil, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and many others. In 2019 alone, Chinese companies invested nearly $13 billion in Latin America, mostly in infrastructure, such as roads, ports, railroads, solar farms, and dams. And like I said before, this is not a brand new phenomenon. Already in 2008, Chinese purchases of minerals and agricultural commodities helped South America stave off the worst privations of the financial crisis. As Bolivia's ex-president Jorge Quiroga explained, people ask me why I prefer the United States. People ask me who I prefer, the United States or Europe. I say Brazil. What about in second place? I say China. That's the reality of South America. During the COVID-19 crisis, too, Latin America once again relies on China, whose middle class drives demand for beef from Uruguay, copper from Chile, oil from Colombia, and soy from Brazil. These commodities help Latin America to weather the storm, and China is the primary customer. As Brazil's ambassador to China has said, we'd rather not be so dependent on exports to China, but what is the alternative? It's just more profitable to sell there than anywhere else. As a result of Chinese investment, China's political power has also grown. The DR, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, and Panama have already switched their recognition from Taiwan to China, which increases the political influence of the mainland both in the UN and in other multilateral institutions. It also allows China to embed standard-setting technology companies such as Huawei, ZTE, and Hikvision, which are sanctioned by the United States in the regional infrastructure of Latin America, effectively allowing Beijing to dictate the rules of commerce for a generation. 19 governments in the Latin American region and the Caribbean have already joined the Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion transcontinental trade and infrastructure network. And by providing masks, protective suits, testing kits, and vaccines, the pandemic has opened up a diplomatic opportunity that China previously simply did not have. As a kind of new Cold War is taking shape, Latin America is a central element of the Chinese Communist Party's global plan to export Chinese ideals and practices beyond the Asia Pacific. And as the United States continues to maintain a naval presence in the South China Sea and a military assistance pact with Taiwan, China at the same time made serious geostrategic moves in Latin America and the Caribbean. One example is Panama, which used to be under heavy US influence, but now China appears to dominate. Of course, ever since the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, the US has been particularly possessive of the Western Hemisphere. And after World War II, the US fought a Cold War with the Soviet Union over Latin American nations attracted to Marxism. As I told you before, the past 4 years tell a story of neglect. Trump only visited Latin America once during the G20 summit in Buenos Aires. Also, as I pointed out earlier, Trump proposed drastic cuts to the foreign aid budget for the Latin America region. And also, he also withheld from the Northern Triangle countries funds that were appropriated by Congress to compel those governments to curb the flow of migrants to the United States. Nevertheless, recognizes China's exponentially growing influence. Already in 2018, the US launched the America Crece initiative as a direct competitor to the Belt and Road. Although in reality it did not attract much attention and no funds were distributed. By contrast to the past 4 years, Joe Biden's presidency likely brings a renewed interest in the battle for influence in the region. Nevertheless, the Biden administration must do a delicate balancing act because many countries in Latin America would stick with China if their backs were against the wall. So President Biden will have to move away from the demonization of China in the region and instead focus on competing against the Asian giant effectively, which specifically means trade, aid, and corporate investment. So the question is, what can we see so far from the Biden administration? Number one, President Biden has requested a nearly $7 billion boost to the foreign aid budget of the United States. So this would obviously, some of this would go to the Northern Triangle, some of this would go to South America, but what we can already see is a reversal of the budget cuts that we saw under President Trump. Another promising initiative came out of Congress, where Senators Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida, and Bob Mendez, Democrat from New Jersey, have proposed groundbreaking legislation that would dedicate 35% of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation's budget to Latin America and the Caribbean for 10 years. Also, the people that President Biden has chosen for some of the top positions in his administration are promising for the Latin America region. These include Alejandro Mayorkas, who is a Cuban American, and he is now Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security. Miguel Cardona, a Puerto Rican American, who is Education Secretary. Xavier Becerra, Health and Human Services Secretary, is Mexican American. And most importantly, perhaps for Latin America, Juan Sebastián González is the National Security Advisor for the Western Hemisphere, and he is originally of Cuban descent. And the last point here that I'm going to make before I move on very briefly to looking at three specific countries in the region is rebuilding credibility in Latin America. Biden can build trust and goodwill by essentially retiring the Monroe Doctrine and instead leading by example and building consensus rather than dictating as a bully, which is something he himself rejects in his memoir, Promise Me, Dad. In terms of democracy and rule of law promotion, the past 4 years were essentially a free pass on democracy and human rights concerns. And some Latin American countries will push back if the Biden administration takes a firm stand on these issues, such as military corruption in Mexico, killing of social leaders in Colombia, or deforestation in Brazil. And these are just some of the examples that we could give. The January 6th attack on the Capitol also has weakened the standing of the United States as a moral authority and the keeper of democracy. Therefore, Biden will have to work to demonstrate that Trump was simply an aberration and that the United States remains committed to human rights, democracy, rule of law, and environmental protection. So as I told you, I'm going to look at 3 countries specifically: Cuba, Colombia, and Venezuela. And I'm going to do it very briefly. First, if we look at Cuba, President Miguel Diaz-Canel of Cuba recognized Joe Biden as U.S. president or president-elect the day after the news organizations in the United States called the race for the former vice president. In a tweet, Diaz-Canel said he hoped for, quote, constructive bilateral relations respecting one another's differences. Nevertheless, Cuban Americans strongly favored Trump in Florida and delivered the state to the Republican. The reason for Biden's campaign, the Biden campaign's poor performance among Cuban Americans, is Trump's Castro Chavismo offense, a homespun Colombian political strategy that seemed to work quite well for Trump, at least in Florida. Historically, Cubans have been single-issue Republican voters, and although Obama could make a dent in this trend during his presidency, Cubans overwhelmingly supported Trump in Florida. So this is not the Cuba question is not an urgent political matter for Biden as far as his domestic constituencies are concerned. Although the Cuba Thaw 2.0 will probably not be a top agenda item for Biden, we can expect the return of Obama-era-esque engagement with Cuba. In other words, the return to the thaw at some point is likely. In fact, when asked about this subject during the campaign, Biden said he would follow the Obama policy. Of course, the Cuban government rejected Obama's efforts in 2016, so it is up to the Cubans to implement social, economic, and political transformation to defuse tensions with the United States. He must, Biden, to move forward with this Cuba Thaw 2.0, he must reach out to President Diaz-Canel and signal the U.S.'s willingness to return to a more constructive relationship. This will start with dismantling the over 100 measures applied by Trump, which not only undid the influence that Barack Obama built in the island, but also harshly punished the Cuban people. Some other logical steps would be reopening the U.S. Embassy in Havana, ending the travel ban to Cuba, and lifting sanctions. The Treasury Department will have to restore regulations to the pre-Trump status quo ante to be able to do this. This will allow cultural exchange, educational exchange, cash remittances to Cuba, and doing business with Cuban companies, and of course, very importantly, U.S.-based travel to the island. This will allow the building and rebuilding of dialogue, not only with political leaders, but also with the opposition and civil society in general. It will also energize Cuba's budding private entrepreneur sector, as well as business engagement with the United States. In the waning days of the Trump presidency, the State Department also redesignated Cuba as a state sponsor of terror, and Biden will very likely reverse this decision as part of his Cuba Thaw 2.0. What is very interesting is that he could do most or all of these things seemingly, all of these things without a seemingly intractable Congress unilaterally, kind of through presidential action. We have to keep in mind, however, that historically unilateral concessions toward totalitarian regimes have failed to achieve U.S. objectives. So Biden should drive toward a no-nonsense policy of quid pro quo, such as a policy of more tourism and humanitarian aid for more freedom and respect for human rights. Next, very briefly, I want to look at Colombia. During the Obama administration, Colombia received a $450 million aid package as part of Peace Colombia, the Peace Colombia initiative. The money was earmarked for development, military, and security assistance, as well as support for building institutions. Trump, by contrast, focused on anti-drug trafficking operations and military cooperation, but jettisoned the part of the Peace Colombia, the rest of the Peace Colombia goals. So a focus on hard power rather than a mix of hard and soft power projections. Early on, the Trump administration signaled its disinterest in promoting democracy and democratic governance, or imposing U.S. values of freedom and democracy. President Trump's America First motto with regard to foreign policy translated into placing what he viewed as contributing to American economic prosperity and security back home above all else. So what can Biden change? How can Biden change course in Colombia? First of all, potentially he could remove the FARC from the U.S. terrorist list. Biden can also refocus U.S. efforts from supporting Colombia's drug war to fighting terrorism. The U.S. spent a grand total of about $11.6 billion on Plan Colombia, a policy that was supposed to reduce illicit drug trafficking and improve security. While it was a counterinsurgency success, however, it was a counter-narcotics failure. One path forward for Biden would be to press the Colombian government to capitalize on the former successes in counterinsurgency in order to defeat ELN or ELN. If the less optimal military route is chosen by the Biden administration, then the U.S. could support the new Comando contra el Narcotráfico y las Amenazas Transnacionales with this new military organization with various intelligence assets at the very least. Alternatively, Biden could also unfreeze the peace talks between the Colombian government and ELN. The Marxist National Liberation Army, which is Colombia's biggest active rebel group. Pablo Beltran, the head of the ELN's peace talks delegation in Havana, hopes that Biden's backing would provide the necessary push to get the negotiations going again. During Trump's presidency, Beltran complained that about U.S. troops being sent to Colombia, President Trump's use of Colombia as the U.S.'s sidekick to attack Venezuela, which he claimed created an environment of more war in the region, and he rejected the Trump administration's focus on forced eradication of coca crops, which went against the policy of illicit crop substitution agreed upon in the 2016 peace accords. It must be acknowledged that the negotiators in Havana, however, have dubious authority to speak for the entirety of ELN, especially the more radical factions, and they cannot leave Colombia. They cannot leave Cuba due to the Interpol arrest warrant that President Duque acquired in 2019 after the terrorist attack in Bogota, for which the ELN took responsibility. Biden should also push the Colombian government to capitalize on the growing rift between the Venezuelan and the Colombian branches of the guerrilla organization. While the Venezuelan branch is growing through steady recruitment, the Colombian branch is appearing willing to demobilize to end the conflict. The Colombian government must also recognize the new political conjuncture that exists as a result of Biden's election and other regional changes, such as the electoral victory of Luis Arce in Bolivia and the Chilean referendum. Duque's government must build a relationship with the Biden-Harris administration, which has been affected by the Colombian politicians, various Colombian politicians' interference in the 2020 election. The Biden-Harris administration, on the other hand, must denarchetize the bilateral relation between the United States and Cuba and Colombia. They must help solve the problem of illicit crops in line with the peace accords, do away with the Cold War style anti-communist discourse, which dominated the regional cooperation under Trump, and revitalize the focus on peace and human rights, which was at the center of Biden's agenda when he was Obama's vice president. With these changes, the administration could likely or hopefully push the Duque administration to be more moderate and to distance itself from the radical elements of Centro Democrático. To negotiate a peace deal between the Colombian government and ELN, Biden must redesignate a special envoy for peace in Colombia and monitor the faithful implementation of the peace agreement. Ultimately, however, there must be mutual understanding and recognition of the responsibilities in the conflict on both sides, the Colombian government and also the guerrillas. And the United States, where there's growing attention to systemic racism, police violence, violence against women and LGBTQ individuals, could use its political capital, political clout to facilitate this understanding and recognition, and to encourage the use of mechanisms such as the Comprehensive System for Truth, Justice, Reparation, and Non-Recurrence created by the 2016 peace accords. But there are a few obstacles to promoting peace talks. One is the assassination of nearly 1,000 social leaders and 237 former combatants of the FARC since 2016. Second, the Biden administration should reassess the crop substitution program included in the peace agreement with the FARC, whose purpose was to pay farmers to uproot coca fields and plant alternative legal crops. Unfortunately for now, it seems Biden is supporting the spraying of glyphosate. This aerial spraying program is widely seen as undermining the peace accords and driving farmers and communities from cooperation. Despite the cohesion crisis, another obstacle to the peace talks is that the ELN remains active, and there have been indications that the group is perhaps planning terrorist attacks even in Bogota. Lastly, very briefly, to talk about Venezuela. The continuing meltdown in Venezuela is another challenge for Joe Biden. Under Maduro, we have seen cataclysmic economic mismanagement and a systematic dismantling of the country's democratic institutions. The result is the largest refugee crisis in the history of Latin America and a humanitarian emergency inside the country. Trump's economic sanctions didn't work in Venezuela, and Maduro regime did not collapse and did not negotiate itself out of power. But instead, what they did achieve is that they were harmful to ordinary citizens due to their exacerbation of the massive humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, tried to lead an effort, that's the picture of the guy in the bottom, tried to bring about regime change there and in Cuba and Nicaragua, which he called the troika of tyranny, but to no avail. As President Biden said, as candidate Biden, Maduro is a dictator, plain and simple, and is causing incredible suffering among the Venezuelan people. The Venezuelan people need our support to recover their democracy and rebuild their country. He proposed support for neighboring countries such as Colombia, and he proposed also a comprehensive strategy, including sanctions, humanitarian assistance, and support for democratic actors to force the regime to embark on the path toward democratization. Given the failures of the Trump administration, military intervention must remain off the table in terms of Venezuela, and instead the focus must remain on multilateral diplomatic strategies in order to not to alienate international partners and the Venezuelan opposition. Biden's administration, in fact, has returned to pragmatic diplomacy with regard to Venezuela by rejoining European efforts to promote serious negotiations. And although Maduro appears open, at least, to talking to Biden, he's also skeptical of U.S. initiatives, which is unsurprising since all U.S. presidents have supported the opposition to the Chavistas, And in 2002, the United States aided the coup d'état against Chavez. The last point here is that Biden also will have to figure out what to do with Juan Guaido. He was unsuccessful in his alternative presidency because he was unable to convince the armed forces to break ranks with Mr. Maduro. Although he doesn't have a formal position anymore, and the European Union no longer recognizes him, the United States is in a much more difficult position to abandon Juan Guaido, who at this point is actually causing a rift among the opposition in Venezuela. And that concludes my analysis of Biden's Latin America policy. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Sure. Well, it was a great insight. Now that you mentioned the three countries, including Cuba and Venezuela, I would like to highlight that the United States pursuit of interests and defense of defense values, it makes, I would like to make a parallel with the Russia-United States relations at the moment. We see that Biden have told him Putin a killer and so on and so forth. But with the regional approach of the United States, we also see that Donald Trump in the past administration have threatened in 2018 Venezuela with a military intervention. Now with Biden, the question is, what have he done in terms of public image, and also because it is important to take in account the vanity in politics. Sometimes the symbolism makes display something about the foreign policy, and especially with Joe Biden, we have seen that he takes very serious the Twitter account and all the communications. He have been a little shy, but if you can tell us which is the approach of Biden with as Bolton brands the troika of tyranny, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which is the approach, and what displays that to the international community.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things here. Give me just 1 second. I showed you guys the picture of John Bolton when he walked into a conference room with that notepad that talked about how many thousands of Colombian soldiers it would take to invade Venezuela. That did not help the United States case. As a matter of fact, it alienated U.S. allies, and Latin American countries do not want to see a military intervention in Venezuela. And instead, what should happen is what we've already seen under President Biden. It should be a multilateral approach. It should be harnessing the political clout of some European negotiators, such as Norway and Switzerland, and it should be better sanctions, smarter sanctions on Venezuela, not sanctions that end up hurting the people of Venezuela. So in terms of Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, Biden would probably be best served, but first of all, in terms of Cuba, by returning to the Cuba thaw, right? So there's really every evidence that building a better dialogue, bringing American capital, opening up the state to international influence would move Cuba along to on the path toward democratization. And it's probably the same for Venezuela. Venezuela very sorely needs humanitarian assistance. The democratic elements within the country need support rather than sort of actions that we saw under President Trump. These failed coup attempts or failed assassination attempts against Maduro. Which really ended up creating more propaganda for the Venezuelan dictator, and sort of led to more demonization of the United States, and also a rejection of this approach in the international community. So, I'm a political scientist. I'm not an international relations scholar, but if I put on my international relations hat, then I would say that liberal internationalism and sort of the liberal approach of multilateral institutions, trade, exchange in terms of cultural, economic, and other areas is the path forward. And this is something that Joe Biden sees. The American people also don't have any appetite for another armed intervention. So. Especially a large-scale one. So it would be rejected right off the bat, also in Latin America and also in North America. So the best path forward, again, is multilateralism, a liberal approach of more openness, more trade, and sort of a quid pro quo type negotiation with these countries, for in exchange for providing more humanitarian assistance, more human rights and individual protections in these countries. In terms of providing more tourism, for example, in in Cuba, there has to be concessions on the part of the Cuban regime as well. So I think that's the best path forward. It's probably not going to yield immediate results, but it would be the most stable and probably profitable outcome in the long term.
All right, thank you, Professor Cantor. If it might be, continue with another question of Ana Piñeros. He said, I would like to ask which aspect will receive more efforts from the Biden administration in terms of Colombian peace process, strengthening peace agreement with FARC or building peace with ELN?
So I think I get most of the question, but I didn't hear the beginning. Sorry, you cut out for a second. So what is likely to happen coming out of the Biden administration in terms of Colombia, more peace process?
I can rewind a little. She asked if the Biden administration, in terms of Colombian peace process, can strengthen the agreement with FARC, or building a peace with the ELN.
So I don't think they are. Well, first of all, I have to say I'm a little bit of a novice when it comes to Colombian politics, but what is most likely to happen? So first of all, I don't see those mutually exclusive. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. So a lot of people have talked about what is going to happen with the peace process, what's going to happen with with the implementation of the peace process with the FARC, and going forward with ELN to achieve some kind of peace. A lot of people have said, it's going to be a return to Peace Colombia. Unfortunately, however, President Biden is not President Obama, and Duque is not Juan Manuel Santos. So it's a different context that we're operating in, and so for that reason, the Biden administration is definitely going to have to push toward peace building rather than militancy. toward pushing the Duque administration to be more middle of the road rather than being hijacked by far right elements. It's very likely that the aid that comes out of the United States will have strings attached. So we're going to see closer monitoring of the implementation process. And so overall, that is going to strengthen the peace agreement that was signed under Santos. But in terms of the ELN, there's no really convincing military solution here, especially because ELN has become this international organization as it has spread to Venezuela also. So that creates a lot of problems in terms of fighting the organization, and so as I said in my talk, the United States has to focus on this rift that is developing between the Venezuelan and the Colombian branches, and it has to capitalize on the willingness to move forward to negotiate. But what is very interesting, of course, is that we're seeing willingness on the part of the negotiators in Havana, but not so much on the part of the Duque government. So again, there has to be they have to push Duque toward to more moderate positions. Whether he has the incentive or not is hard for me to say.
Thank you for your answer, Professor Cantor. There's another question from Moises, I think. It said, can USA stop China's influence in Latin America and Russian military influence?
So, in terms of China, no. Not only can it not, but it shouldn't even try. As I was trying to explain in my talk there, China has really strong influence in Latin America, and so the United States shouldn't try to stop China from influencing Latin America in terms of trade, but the United States should compete effectively. But for the U.S. to be able to compete effectively, there has to be more commitment toward international development in the Latin American region. Now, in terms of the influence of China, the political influence of China, or normalizing some of the political positions of China, that is where the United States also has to do a much better job. But this requires soft power projection. This requires sort of first of all, reestablishing American legitimacy in the region, establishing the fact that the United States is committed to certain positions such as human rights, environment, and so on and so forth. And so this is a large undertaking. This is something that also cannot be done overnight. But I think this is a problem that exists everywhere in the world as far as the U.S. is concerned. It's also a problem with Europe. That a lot of leaders in the world are somewhat hesitant to engage with the United States because they're worried that the U.S. is no longer a reliable negotiating partner. And so for that reason, I would say yes, the U.S. has to counter Chinese influence, but it has to be sort of a rules-based managed competition with China. I think the Marco Rubio, Bob Menendez Act is a good place to start, committing resources to Latin America in terms of competing with the Belt and Road and other initiatives. And in terms of the political influence of China, there's a lot of goodwill that is being built by China by providing vaccine supplies, for example. The U.S. also has to be able to compete there. So it's a multi-dimensional approach. But what the U.S. definitely shouldn't do is what we saw under President Trump, which is a sort of single-minded demonization of China that doesn't really lead to positive outcomes. Axel, you also sent me a question here. How does the Biden administration evaluate the growing influence of China and Russia and Latin America in the context of the pandemic, with the majority of countries buying vaccines from them? So, this is the big problem, as I said in the talk, and there's no clear path forward for the United States in terms of vaccine diplomacy in Latin America. There's a very clear path forward into the Quad cooperation and sort of the infrastructure that's being built in Asia to disseminate. I think 1 billion doses by the end of 2022, and that's a noble and a great and a very strategic undertaking. Now, when it comes to Latin America, the United States needs to do a lot more for the reasons that I said: strategic self-interest, and also sort of curbing the political influence of China and Russia. The U.S., like I said, by July is going to have almost a billion extra doses, and the U.S. can ramp up production, and so those would be the right steps for the United States to take. One would hope that the National Security Advisor for the Western Hemisphere would guide Biden in the right direction in this area. There's a bunch of other issues also in Latin America. Why Sinovac is so popular. Part of it is that it doesn't require the same infrastructure in terms of transportation and storage that we see, for example, with Pfizer and Moderna. That require sort of a much more advanced infrastructure because of cooling and other issues. So again, the United States has to do a better job competing with China, and I laid out to you guys the reasons why that is so necessary. We're going to see, I think, in the coming weeks, as the United States starts building a really sizable backup supply, what they end up doing with those vaccines. Hopefully, what we saw in terms of Mexico and Canada, the donation of those AstraZeneca vaccines, is an indication of what is to come, and I hope that will happen.
Okay. So I think that's all the questions. I highly give you thanks for this conversation, very carefully detailed and educated conversation in behalf of CIBEI Foundation. And also I would like to encourage all the attendants to follow us in the social networks: Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and also some greetings from Colombia. Here 11:30 a.m. and well, it was nice to have all you here, from Mexico to Argentina. We also like to highlight our internship program that actually have college students from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay, Argentina, Costa Rica, and so on. So without further ado, we give you thanks, Professor. It was highly appreciated time with you, and all the attendants. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me, and I wish everybody a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. See you.
Bye-bye.